with Jackie LUQMAN, and we are your #1 source for struggle, socialism, and soul. That's right, my friend. Your ears do not deceive you. Jackie are back. This is our new show, Darker Than Blue, here on WPFW in Washington, D.C., coming to you every Friday at 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I couldn't think of a better way to kick off our new show on this new platform than to bring on a host that we all know and love, and that is Dr. Gerald Horne, Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, and the author of dozens of books, including most recently, Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C. for the years 1900 to 2000. Dr. Horne, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely, Doctor. And, you know, to kick things off, Doctor, of course, we are now entering, by my count, 91 days of Israel's war on Gaza and on Palestine. Of course, this is part and parcel of the genocidal project that is apartheid Israel that's been raging for all this time. And one of the more interesting developments here recently, among other things, is the fact that South Africa has elected to take Israel to the International Court of Justice for the crime of genocide inside Gaza. And this 84-page long application says in part, quote, "The acts and omissions by Israel are genocidal in character because they are intended to bring about the destruction of a substantial part of the Palestinian national, racial, and ethnic group." And this is the part that really struck me. It says, quote, "The level of mortality in Palestinian families is such that medics in Gaza have had to coin a new acronym, WCNSF, meaning Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. For Palestinian children in particular, death is everywhere." Now, of course, Dr. Horne, there's a few countries on earth more qualified or with more moral standing to call out and identify apartheid than the state of South Africa. And so I'm sort of curious your thoughts about this petition of South Africa to the ICJ over Israel's crimes in Gaza, and how do you think it plays until this whole broader issue of Israel's war on Gaza?
Well, the good news is that there is a complementary campaign spearheaded by Black Alliance for Peace, the U.S. Peace Council, other progressives, pro-ceasefire organizations on the left in the United States that are trying to drum up support for this profound South African petition, because we know that if the International Court of Justice engages in extensive fact-finding and comes out with some sort of judgment, inevitably it'll be returned to the United Nations Security Council, where, if history is any guide, the United States will exercise its veto. So it's more important than ever for folks on this side of the Atlantic to weigh in. And certainly your point is well taken with regard to South Africa leading the charge. After all, there was nuclear collaboration between the apartheid regime and Israel before independence in South Africa in 1994. We know that South Africa has a substantial Zionist community. In fact, the leading Israeli spokesperson during the unlamented 1967 war against Egypt, Syria, and other nations was Abba Eban, whose roots were planted deeply in the soil of South Africa. He was a son of apartheid. And we also know that South Africa is heading towards elections in 2024. And given the fact that former President Jacob Zuma, a former leader of the African National Congress, is now sworn that he will not support the ANC during these elections, he'll support this new party, the so-called MK party. This presents an opportunity for U.S. imperialism to meddle in the internal affairs of South Africa, which it has been doing in any case. And we also know that the U.S. spokesperson, John Kirby, already has dismissed this South African petition as being without merit, without foundation, baseless, and that tips his hand, to put it mildly, and reveals and exposes the Biden administration's approach to this, because I think that U.S. imperialism may be aware of something that I trust and I hope our audience will be made aware of, which is that, among other things, the South African petition may have presidential value. What I mean by that is, if Israel can be dragged before the International Court of Justice on a genocide petition, why not revive the genocide petition filed some decades ago by the late, great Paul Robeson, which charged the United States with genocide against Black people, in light of the fact that we have escalating infant mortality rates, Black women dying in childbirth, in light of the disproportionate exercise of the death penalty by various states against Black people, in light of this epidemic of police slayings, it's well past time to consider, if not execute, a genocide petition against the United States government, which will also have the collateral benefit of mobilizing the international community on our behalf and perhaps lessening this deep-seated and profound oppression which we are now grappling with.
Yeah, and something else important about South Africa filing this petition in the International Court of Justice, as opposed to filing it in the International Criminal Court. Now, most people probably don't know what the difference is between these two institutions, but I think it's very stark and it's very telling why South Africa didn't file this petition in the ICC, because that's the first place everybody always says that, you know, war criminals need to be sent to, and we see how that works out. They're usually not, unless, of course, they're African. And so I wonder if you can help people understand the difference between filing this petition in the ICJ as opposed to the ICC, and why that's actually very important.
Well, I think you put your finger on the issue when you suggested that the ICC has been derelict in its duties. In your comment that it seems to have a proclivity for going after African leaders above all. And we know that the chief prosecutor of the ICC was just in the region. And apparently his position is to take Hamas before the ICC, which of course will win him plaudits in Washington, but is a subject for derision elsewhere. Now, with regard to the genocide petition, it goes after states. And it is a state that is committing genocide. Although, of course, at the switch are individuals. But more than that, it goes after states. And it should allow, in a best case scenario, either for deepening sanctions against this state, perhaps deepening sanctions against their aiders and abettors, which would be Washington in the first instance, not to mention its NATO allies, particularly the Federal Republic of Germany, which has played a despicable role with regard to this conflict, in the sense that what's happening is that supposedly to do penance for the ethno-nationalist regime in Berlin from the 1930s to mid-1940s, Germany, Berlin, is now going to support an ethno-nationalist regime in historic Palestine. Now, obviously, that's some bizarre logic, bizarre reasoning, but that is what we're faced with. And that is more reason amongst many why we should be backing this heroic South African petition.
Yeah, and I also can't help but wonder, Doctor, when we think about the impact that this war on Gaza started by Israel is having on the United States. I mean, of course, next year we'll be heading into yet another election cycle where, you know, we'll be told it's the most important election of our lives. And, you know, that whole rigmarole that we hear every 2 and 4 years. But I think on the one hand, U.S. President Joseph Robinette Biden has done himself a pretty grand disservice in terms of his unwavering support for Israel. And, his administration recently even circumventing Congress to sell some shells, some tank shells to Israel. I mean, this has tanked his approval ratings with Arab Americans, quite naturally. It has tanked his approval ratings with young people. And that is something that Biden simply cannot afford at all. You know what I mean? And on top of the fact that, this is flowing in a time also where there are ongoing impacts from the beginnings of COVID-19. Of course, there's the war in Ukraine, which has continued sort of on in the background, I think, in terms of people's consciousness to a considerable extent ever since Israel began its latest war on Gaza. But even if you take a step back and look at the sort of Ukraine situation, I mean, Russian President Vladimir Putin, of course, recently addressed a meeting of the Russian Defense Ministry Board. This was a couple weeks ago, kind of later on in December, and basically talking about how the West's narratives and its, sort of purported goals have failed. It wanted to carry out a military victory against Russia. That has not happened. They wanted to very obviously carry out regime change in Russia to remove Vladimir Putin as head of state. That also has not happened. Joe Biden talked about how he wanted to turn the ruble into rubble. That's certainly has not happened. I mean, they're doing pretty good over there economically, is my impression. But what I'm really asking, Doctor, is what does the current Israeli war on Gaza, what does it mean, you think, for a U.S. imperialism that is starting to feel increasingly stretched to its limit?
Well, first of all, the war on Gaza distracts the United States from what we are told is its primary objective, which is destabilizing the Communist Party of China. Interestingly enough, Israel itself, over recent years, has had a rather warm relationship with China, up to and including, according to credible sources, leaking sophisticated U.S. military technology to People's Republic of China, although, of course, they're disappointed that China and Russia have not come to the defense of Israel and the United Nations with regard to its war crimes against Gaza. Certainly, this war in Gaza is having negative impact in the United States of America, particularly on civil liberties. We know, for example, that at Columbia University, as a result of the militancy of faculty, staff, and students, the administration, under tremendous pressure from the Zionist lobby, has chosen to suspend for a while Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voices for Peace, the vanguard of the pro-ceasefire movement. We also know that with regard to this right-wing attempt to move these universities further to the right than they already are, they claimed in their minds, in their words, a quote, scalp, unquote, a very disturbing use of phraseology, I might say, when the first Black president of Harvard University, Claudine Gay, was forced out because she was not seen as being sufficiently enthusiastic for Zionism. Now, if you look at her statements, it seemed pretty enthusiastic to me, but obviously they're raising the bar. And this also raises a related issue, which is that the purging of Claudine Gay is a first step towards purging the academy of Black people, and I would say particularly Black progressive people. I don't necessarily consider Claudine Gay to be in that category, but the fact that she can be knocked off does not bode well for those of us who are to her left. And it's interesting how she was bumped off or scalped, to use their unfortunate verb. That is to say that at that congressional hearing a few weeks ago, she was snookered into agreeing with the idea that the concept of intifada, or uprising against Zionist oppression, is somehow intimating genocide against Jewish people. And likewise, the slogan from the river to the sea means likewise, although from the river to the sea could conceivably mean from the West Bank on the Jordan River to Gaza on the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine will be free. But demagogy is the calling card for the Zionists, who, by the way, also are going after a goodly number of Black members of Congress who they do not feel are sufficiently pro-Zionist. I'm thinking of Congresswoman Cori Bush of St. Louis, Congressman Andre Carson of Indiana, who happens to be Muslim, Congresswoman Summer Lee of Western Pennsylvania, Congressman Jamal Bowman of Bronx Westchester. Apparently, the Zionist lobby will be spending upwards of $100 million with members of the Congressional Black Caucus surely in the crosshairs. Now, what's remarkable there is that you would think that they would be satisfied with the fact that the alleged speaker in waiting, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries of Brooklyn, has signed on to their agenda. Likewise, other members of the so-called New York City leadership, including Mayor Eric Adams, the Reverend Al Sharpton, not to mention Gregory Meeks, the ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee from Southeast Queens. But that's not enough. It's as if they're rehearsing the old tune from back in the day. 99.5 just won't do. It has to be 100% of the Black leadership that's on board. And so that's what we're faced with. And that's why it's so important for us to be mobilizing for this demonstration on January 13th in the District of Columbia. Now, obviously, in the midst of winter, we are going to be heavily dependent upon a massive turnout from the DMV, from the district, from Maryland, from Virginia, although, of course, that does not bar folks from New York City, from Pennsylvania, from the Carolinas from attending as well. So we have work to do, and I am confident that we will accomplish our goals.
Yeah, and it's that sticky wicket of the Congressional Black Caucus and their ineffectiveness in being representatives of the people, but even more so now in this situation with Palestine. None of these people have really come out and been openly supportive of Palestine, of Palestinians, of their right to exist. Most of them have done, with the exception of one or two, I think, have as you pointed out, Doctor, have made it clear that they are, at least in public, to keep their jobs on the side of the Zionist project. And for me, as an organizer, I do wonder what we do with that knowledge that these people who are certainly, as you point out, in the crosshairs of this extended Zionist project here in the US, they're definitely, their jobs are being, they're next, basically. How do we square that with organizing against this new iteration of Red Scare, Black Scare? Because this is what it looks and feels and sounds like to me, another iteration of that, while also recognizing that these folks who are in the crosshairs of this extended Zionist entity here in the US, they're not our friends either. So what do we do with the Congressional Black Caucus and all of the Black and so-called progressive leaders who played progressive to get elected, and now they're very much Zionists?
Well, I think we need to do a microscopic analysis. I mean, certainly, I think it would be a mistake to join in the Zionist lobby, join with the Zionist lobby in terms of trying to rout, for example, Congresswoman Cori Bush of St. Louis. I mean, you have to look at who she's running against. Of course, we know that one of her opponents in the primary will be a man who replaced Kim Gardner, who was a progressive St. Louis County prosecutor, a Black woman. And now he helped to knock Kim Gardner off. Now he's going after Cori Bush. I think we have to also recognize the strength of our own forces. It reminds me of following Caribbean politics back in the day when the Caribbean progressives introduced the concept of critical support. That is to say, on the one hand, they would support folks like Jamal Bowman, for example, of Bronx Westchester, but would not give him a pass to the extent that he had not signed on altogether to a progressive agenda. Otherwise, I think that we'll just be out in the cold, and we'll basically make ourselves marginal and irrelevant. And likewise, I think that we have to point out what's happening right now is that the planet is going through this profound global shift away from the hegemony and domination of the North Atlantic countries, which has been in place, depending upon how you look at history, for 200 years or 500 years. And in its stead is arising the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now, you see some rather startling reactions to this global shift. For example, in Argentina, which had received an invitation to join the BRICS, their newly elected president, Milei, is so convinced of the continued vitality of the North Atlantic bloc that he slapped the invitation aside and has pledged to try to move to dollarize his economy, which is going to be an impossible task because nobody will lend him the dollars, and Argentina does not have the dollars. And so, likewise, I think that if you look at the Black community, when our leadership in 1954 embarked on what I call the Compromise of 1954, in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions, we throw overboard the left wing. Paul Robeson, in the first instance, still being punished and pulverized for his having the moxie and the gumption to file the genocide petition against the United States of America. Now, that seemed like a good deal to some at the time, but now that wager, which basically and implicitly was a wager on the continued hegemony and domination of U.S. imperialism, seems to be a bad bet, because U.S. imperialism has one foot on a banana peel. And there's been talk about the Israelis deporting the Gazan population to Congo, for example, just like Britain is seeking to deport undocumented workers to Rwanda, for example. Now, Black Americans can cluck their tongues and say, oh, what a shame, or we can recall our own history some decades ago when there was a concerted attempt to deport all of us. Now, I think that there are those of us who would want to leave this hellhole called the United States of America, but we should do it voluntarily, not involuntarily. And so the stakes are high with regard to this present crisis in historic Palestine. The stakes are high with regard to how we dig ourselves out of the deep hole in which we find ourselves.
Absolutely. And I mean, you talking about Claudine Gay makes me think of a number of things, Doctor. I mean, number one, I think you're absolutely right that her ouster seems to be a kind of warning shot for anyone who, dares to step outside a politic, even as accommodating as she tried to be. And I hope people, especially young people, realize that you can't be accommodating enough in a moment like this. You can't be Zionist enough. You can't be reactionary enough if you're not actually parroting the things that are considered to be appropriate. Well, then that's grounds for your removal. But a couple of times already this hour, Doctor, we've touched on different things happening in the African continent. And I wanted to turn our attention back there for a couple of other developments. I mean, in Sudan, of course, civil war continues to rage. Hundreds of thousands of people displaced, dealing with poverty, dealing with hunger. And of course, this is coming 5 years after the December Revolution of 2018, where we saw mass demonstrations protesting poor conditions, the rising cost of living, and this led to the ouster of then President Omar al-Bashir. And then, of course, elsewhere on the continent in Kenya, President William Ruto has been having some serious tensions with the judiciary. I mean, recently he accused some judges that he did not name of working with opposition elements in order to delay some government projects. And so, I mean, what do you sort of make of these developments here in different aspects of the, I should say, different parts of the African continent? And do you see sort of a common thread there?
Well, I think part of the problem with regard to that part of Africa is that neocolonialism has stood firmly against the idea that African nations should be able to develop a strong state apparatus. And this weakened state apparatus has then created fertile conditions for the fomenting of civil unrest and civil conflict. And you see this in Sudan, in particular, where the so-called rapid support forces have been at odds with the military regime. And what's happening is that the rapid support forces, in many ways, have fought the regime to a standstill. And because of the weakened state apparatus, this has allowed Kenya to extend invitations to the RSF leadership to engage in talks, which is quite extraordinary, quite irregular. And it's also, and one more point, in Kenya's favor in terms of it being the fair-haired boy of U.S. imperialism, because as you know, Kenya also has been negotiating to send police forces to Haiti at the behest of U.S. imperialism. Now, there are those in the Kenyan parliament that have objected, but President William Ruto seems determined to push that through so that Kenyans can go to the Caribbean to lose their lives. And you see something parallel, in a sense, with regard to the relationship between Ethiopia, one of the most populous nations on the African continent, and its neighbor, speaking of Somalia. What's happened there is that for a few years now, Somaliland has not been, in its estimation, under the jurisdiction of the larger Mogadishu-based regime of Somalia. And of late, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has talked about how Ethiopia needs an outlet to the Red Sea. Recall that it lost its outlet to the Red Sea when Eritrea broke away about 3 decades or so ago. And so we had thought that that would mean that Addis Ababa would try to reignite its conflict with Eritrea, but I guess it learned its lesson in terms of past conflicts. Instead, it's broken an agreement with Somaliland, once again, once part of the larger Somalia, but now in a kind of de facto independent status, to have that particular territory provide an outlet to the Red Sea in return for de facto recognition or actual recognition of Somaliland independence by Addis Ababa, and also an integration economically, because Somaliland will also apparently have a stake in Ethiopian Airways, which is probably the leading carrier, African carrier, the leading carrier on the African continent. And by the way, Ethiopian Airways, when it came to existence in the 1930s and 1940s, it came into existence in no small measure at the instigation of a number of Black American airline pilots, interestingly enough. So once again, you see something similar and akin to the relationship between Kenya and Sudan, insofar as a weakened state in Somalia has created fertile conditions for Somaliland, which, by the way, has a representative in Washington, D.C., although apparently not recognized diplomatically as a state, but it allows Somaliland to now negotiate directly with Addis Ababa. And one of the ways we need to deal with this, of course, is to step up our demands and our push for a strengthened state to combat the neocolonialism, which is at the root of this problem.
Absolutely. And real quick, I wanted to remind everyone you are listening to Darker Than Blue on WPFW here in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackman, here with Jackie LUQMAN. We continue to be joined by Dr. Gerald Horne. And also, I wanted to let folks know about that demonstration that Dr. Horne was mentioning a little earlier in our conversation. And what he's talking about is the March on Washington for Gaza, which will be taking place on January 13th here in Washington, D.C. It's being organized by groups like American Muslims for Palestine, Muslim American Society, CARE, Muslim Ummah of North America, with the Answer Coalition as the national partner, which means Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. So if you want to find out more, if you want to hop on a bus, I want to encourage you to check out march4gaza.org. That's march, the number 4gaza.org. Jackie LUQMAN.
Yeah, I'm really glad that, we are talking about the situation on the continent, because there are so many situations on the continent. And, unfortunately, what's going on in the Congo, Dr. Horne, is horrific and has been horrific for quite some time. And I'm noticing in these protests and demonstrations in support of Palestine, that a very important thing is happening, that people are starting to connect the struggles of people in Haiti, in Congo, even here domestically, to the struggle for liberation of the Palestinian people. How do you see, like, the situation in, I believe it's Burkina Faso, where there have been a few assassination attempts that have been thwarted. Thankfully, there has been some unrest against the orchestrated unrest, not unrest from the people, orchestrated against the military transitional government in Guinea-Bissau. There have been some suspicious happenings against the transitional government in Mali. And these are the countries that have gotten together to oust France, to repudiate imperialism and imperialist and capitalist influence in their countries, to the point that they have, or they're on the brink of, I believe, making a historic deal between each other, these three countries, that at least the United States, as the major imperialists in modern times, have been trying to stop from happening for decades. And certainly, France and other countries have not wanted this to happen also. How do you see these struggles in these African nations for what I see as, in most cases, not all, in most cases where Africans are turning against the colonizers? How do you see this as a part of, or do you see this as a part of the greater struggle of oppressed people that Palestine represents, that we do need to connect together?
Well, first of all, with regard to Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the most recent news is that they banded together in a kind of confederation, the Alliance of Sahel States. What they have in common, obviously, is their joint struggle against French neocolonialism on the one hand, and on the other hand, they're all facing insurgencies from religious zealots. Now, there hangs a tail, because we know that U.S. imperialism, its protestations to the contrary, is not opposed to aligning with religious zealots. They did that in Syria, for example. When I saw the bombing take place in Iran, apparently at the hands of the so-called Islamic State, we recall that these religious zealots, the United States supported in Afghanistan before the rise of the Taliban against the left-leaning People's Democratic Party in Kabul, which was aligned with the then Soviet Union. And so we have to be aware of the fact that these religious insurgencies, so-called, in the Alliance of Sahel States may ultimately, or even practically today, be receiving some sort of assistance from the French neocolonialists and their U.S. backers. Likewise, part of the positive aspect coming out of the change of regime in Niger in late July of 2023 is that it put the spotlight and the glare on Nigeria, the continent's largest economy, the most populous nation, a nation which by the end of the century may have a population larger than that of the United States of America, believe it or not, and certainly is bound to play an ever more profound role in both continental and global affairs. Well, interestingly enough, President Tinubu of Nigeria, recently installed, was making noises about banding together an intervention force to topple the new regime in Niger, the new regime, which of course is opposed to French neocolonialism, under the guise of an ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States intervention. But what helped to intervene was not only civil society in Nigeria, which then brought out the news that President Tinubu himself, when he was a student in Chicago some years ago, fled the United States because of various acts of criminality. And apparently, when he was under pressure from Washington to intervene in Niger, the Washington authorities were keeping these criminal files away from investigative journalists in Nigeria in order to prod him. But ultimately, it seems to me the truth will out. And if the truth does out, that'll be a step forward in terms of pushing Abuja, that is to say, pushing Nigeria more to the left. Now, with regard to Congo, what's remarkable there is that it circles back to our opening dialogue about Palestine. Recall, I was talking about this harebrained scheme of deporting Gazans into Congo. Well, the missing link there, or the actual link there, is Dan Gertler, who is an Israeli billionaire who plays a central and essential role in the Congolese economy. And by the way, as you know, Congo is essential to the green economy. It produces 70% of the world's cobalt. It produces coltan, essential to those mobile phones that are so ubiquitous in the North Atlantic community. And it seems to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu would not have cooked up this harebrained scheme without a heads up to Dan Gertler. And certainly in WPFW, broadcasting in the nation's capital, we have to put the spotlight on that particular issue. I should also mention or follow up on the other point that you mentioned, which is how these struggles are linked, because one of the other positive aspects of this focus on historic Palestine is that the phrase settler colonialism has come into use. But interestingly enough, it has not necessarily been used to describe what's going on in North America, although this is obviously Exhibit A with regard to a settler colonial regime, which helps to explain why U.S. is so adamant about supporting the war criminals, because they feel that a blow against settler colonialism in historic Palestine will be a blow against settler colonialism in North America. And they probably have a point. Likewise, to go back to the question, or to really relate further to this question, the United Arab Emirates has been essential in terms of this conflict emerging between Ethiopia and Somalia, because the port that Ethiopia will be operating in Somaliland, once part of Somalia, and Somalia would say it's still a part of Somalia, the port is operated by the UAE. And now UAE is playing all sorts of games. It's involved in the conflict in Sudan of backing one force against another. There have been credible rumors that despite the fact that the Arab world is in an uproar about what's going on in historic Palestine, that Abu Dhabi, which plays the key political role in the UAE, is not necessarily unhappy about what they see as the pummeling of Hamas, which is seen to be all too close to the Muslim Brotherhood, which the UAE and Abu Dhabi sees as public enemy number one. And so, once again, all of this news, it highlights not only the linkages between and amongst all of our struggles, but it also happens to highlight the important and critical role of WPFW in the nation's capital.
Yeah, and Dr. Horne, also know that you've got some books coming out, some stuff in the pipeline. You seem like you always do, and I just wanted to talk some about that to see what's in store for us here.
Well, Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Gerald Horne, that dropped a few months ago. And actually, we had a very successful signing and launch at Montgomery College, just across the district line in Maryland, just a few weeks ago. And this other book, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne Reader, which is a compilation of essays and reviews stretching back decades with comments on Black nationalism's relationship to Japan, the Watts Revolt of 1965, and the revolt following the acquittal of the police officers in Los Angeles caught on tape beating Rodney King, that revolt taking place in 1992, the anti-apartheid movement, the Ukraine crisis. I have a piece on that where I try to give an analysis of Russian history, which I think is, if I must say so, a rather unique and sheds light on this crisis in Ukraine that I think your audience will find revealing. But in 5 or 6 months, I'll have this other book out entitled Armed Struggle, ? Panthers and Communists, Black nationalists and liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Now, this book, as the title suggests, not only deals with armed struggle, that is to say, attempts during that tumultuous period to launch guerrilla warfare in the United States of America, with cadre being trained in the hills south of Oakland, for example. I start the book with Panthers meeting in Algeria with representatives from the Czechoslovakian government, then socialist Czechoslovakian government, to get arms for the Panthers. I reel back to the 1930s during the days of the Communist International, when US communists and others were being trained in Moscow in various aspects of guerrilla war, although admittedly they were being trained to be dispatched to fight during the Civil War in Spain. And what I'm trying to do in this book, amongst other things, is provide some sorts of guidelines and a refresher course, because the way this country is now headed, with the scent of fascism invading our nostrils, it cannot be ruled out that there may come a time at some point in this century for armed struggle to be launched once again. And if that does happen, I trust and I hope that our cadre will not repeat the mistakes that were made in the 1960s and 1970s. For example, alienating socialist Cuba, which was one of their major blunders. Mm-hmm. For example, not having an analysis of the forces on the ground in North America. That is to say, whether people were unwilling to live in the old way, whether the ruling class was unable to rule in the old way, and whether or not there was a political party that was able to lead folks to the next stage of the struggle. So that book will drop in a few months, and I look forward to coming to Washington to my favorite bookstore, Sankofa, right across the street from Howard University, to discuss that particular tome.
Yeah, I can't wait for that either, because I already have a bunch of questions and I'm going to try to save them for you. But this thing about a lack of understanding of our own revolutionary history, I think it has, I don't know, I think it's shocked me how much we who are supposed to be in this revolution, or at least we say we are, we don't know this history that you're writing about, which is why I'm so glad that there continues to be a reputable, knowledgeable source for this history. So we can't continue to claim that, the white man is whitewashing all our history. No, he's not. We've got Dr. Gerald Horne to remind us of what we have been through. And do you think, Dr. Horne, this is the thing that has surprised me over the past 4 months, how surprised people are at how so-called Americans can cheer on genocide. I am confused about how much people have not learned about Americanism, about what, this American idealism, what it really is, what settler colonialism really is. And I think that has been more shocking to me, people not realizing why Americans would cheer on genocide. as much as the fact that people are cheering on genocide, like it's happening right now, and people are actually like taking a big G and their pom-poms and saying, yeah, yay, genocide. What has this been like for you, a historian who tracks these phenomenon, these eras in history, and connects them to the long history of struggle, and hopefully guides us to where we are going to win? But I find it hard to believe that we're going to win when we don't even realize our enemy, with like they're everywhere, right?
Well, obviously, we have to cut our way through a lot of demagogic propaganda in order to get to some sense of reality. I mean, for example, I'm old enough to recall that during the so-called urban unrest of the 1960s, the Watts Revolt, 1965, Newark, Detroit, 1967, the era of the so-called long hot summer, that the propaganda coming from the halls of Capitol Hill was violence doesn't solve anything, violence doesn't settle anything. And even then, I was sufficiently perspicacious and knowledgeable to say, wait a minute. I mean, violence helped to take the land from the Native Americans and establish the United States in the first place. So why are you telling us this? And I think that one of the reasons why there can be such a blasé approach to genocide in historic Palestine, because there's been a blasé approach to genocide in North America. In my Texas book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, I think it's on page 26, there's a long footnote that lists about 30 different ethnic groups, what might be called Indian tribes, in Texas alone that no longer exists, liquidated, gone with the wind. And about 200 years ago, the Comanches were the lords of the plains in this part of North America, and they were virtually liquidated from the barrel of a gun. And so if that is the country in which you reside, well, then understandably, perhaps, you can see why there is such a lethargic approach to confronting genocide in historic Palestine. And with regard to our history, obviously, we have quite a bit of history to learn from and rely on. All of us, I'm sure, recognize the heroism of the late, great John Brown, who in 1859 sought to lead an armed revolt against enslavement of Africans due west of where you're sitting in what was then Virginia, what is now West Virginia, in Harper's Ferry, and paid the ultimate price with his life. Although, of course, that was a spark that led to the Prairie Fire of Civil War, and then Civil War, which led to the abolition of slavery, perhaps would not have taken place but for the participation of hundreds of thousands of Black men in particular, who fought arms in hand to defeat the slave-owning secessionists. And there is a lesson there with regard to historic Palestine, because I think that just like the war criminals in Israel are overreaching right now, their predecessors in the so-called Confederate States of America overreached, and they wound up losing everything, including their most valuable property. That is to say, their investment in enslaved Africans. The war criminals in Israel are overreaching. They say they're fighting a multi-front war, including Lebanon, where they were fought to a standstill in 2006, including Yemen, which I think is going to be ultimately one of the most important fronts of all, because with vessels being able to not go through the Red Sea to the Suez Canal, that's going to lead to the longer route around the Cape of Good Hope to get to Europe from Asia, or alternatively, the Arctic route over northern Russia, or alternatively, the train route from eastern China heading west to Western Europe. Interestingly enough, and coincidentally enough, those are all BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, nations that are benefiting from what the Yemenis are doing, coincidentally enough. And so I think it's possible that the Israeli authorities may be emulating the so-called Confederates by gambling, overreaching, and winding up losing everything that is something that we must seriously consider. But back to this thread of the armed struggle and arms, not only during the US Civil War, not only with John Brown, but some of the most stirring episodes in 20th century Black American history. Not only the Panthers, which I'm writing about in this upcoming book, but some of your older listeners might be familiar with the case of Dr. Sweet in Detroit, who fought off, arms in hand, a invasion of his home by racists, and as a result was able to rally the Black community in his defense, was able to hire the great lawyer Clarence Darrow to be his lawyer. It really helped to catapult the NAACP further into the stratosphere, because NAACP rallied to his defense. I'm sure some of your listeners might find that hard to believe, but it was a different NAACP then.
Right.
And so these are the sorts of lessons we need to acquaint ourselves with to steel ourselves for these forthcoming battles that surely will emerge.
Absolutely. And you know, Jackie, Dr. Horne is so right in this this hypocritical way that the imperialist U.S. state seeks to monopolize violence to the detriment of the masses of poor, working, and oppressed people. And so the European in this thinking, the European was correct in using genocidal violence against the indigenous people of this land, but the indigenous people that fought back were wrong. Similarly, in this thinking, the European was correct in kidnapping Africans and forcing them to build not only this country, but a number of others, and really help set capitalism as a worldwide economic force. They were correct in doing that, but the Africans who revolted were incorrect.
Not only incorrect, that we were insane.
I was just about to raise that. Like they named the whole condition drapetomania. If you wanted to escape slavery, it wasn't because you don't like being enslaved like any other human being. It's because you are out of your mind. And so, in so many ways, this is kind of how we see, you know, white supremacy sort of being ensconced and enshrined in this country, and that logic absolutely trickles down to the question of Palestine, because what did we hear in those early days? First of all, it was all this focus, and to this day, actually, all this focus on Hamas, completely ignoring the fact that there's a number of different resistance groups involved here. And when I say different groups, I mean, you know, these are disparate organizations. Some of them are religious, some of them are secular, some of them are socialist, some of them are nationalists, some of them have been doing armed struggle for a long time. Others don't really have that history. So those groups, along with civil society groups in Palestine, along with the Palestinian people themselves, support the resistance. But this righteous and just resistance to settler colonialism and to the apartheid state of Israel in the US and in the West is being labeled terrorism. So the US giving Israel $3 and $4 billion a year to further its genocide of Palestine, that violence is okay. But here again, when we have a colonized people striking back, well, not only are they wrong, not only are they criminal, they're the worst kind of criminal, they're terrorists. You know what I mean? And so I feel like this is a through line that we tend to see throughout that history, Jackie.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, it doesn't, we don't see this just in the major events, not, you know, not just in a war, a genocide situation. I think we always also see this in moments in history where people who are not among the oppressed class stumble upon the truth and they try to tell everybody the truth, and the exact same thing happens. And this is, I'm thinking of Gary Webb, whose death, who was killed. I'm going to continue to say he was killed. He did not commit suicide by shooting himself twice in the head. That's just physically impossible. But he broke the CIA being involved in cocaine and crack trafficking, and cocaine trafficking more specifically. And what happened with the story about Gary Webb wasn't look at this journalist who uncovered this incredible, horrible thing that this government has done. But the story became, well, Gary Webb is his sources are shady, and it became all about his reputation. And what the CIA was found to do, was found to have done, that wasn't so bad. That wasn't the so we never got a chance to prosecute the actual criminals. The criminals turned around and persecuted Gary Webb, and his reputation is still being argued to this day, which is I think is an absolute crime against this man and the incredible work that he did do, Dr. Horne.
Absolutely.
Yes,
And I mean, we're in our last few minutes here, but what happened to Gary Webb is absolutely criminal, precisely because his work was directly connected to exposing how, I mean, the U.S. government is hustling dope to serve imperialism.
Mhm.
And I mean, there's just no other way to put it, really. And when we look through the 90s, what people call the crack era, I mean, we see the results. I mean, the devastation in cities like DC, in New York, and in towns big and small. So without question, rest in peace to Gary Webb. I want to let our listeners know that coming up here after Darker Than Blue on WPFW, we will have News and Views with Garland Nixon. So you have that to look forward to. And so, you know, as we start to wrap up here in our first episode of Darker Than Blue, I want to thank everyone who tuned in. I want to thank all of you who have been reaching out to Jackie and letting us know that you appreciate the work we did on our other show and how you missed it. I mean, I was literally on my way here today and someone called and told me that, you know, it was such a loss when our show went off the air. And so it's very touching and very motivating for people to still feel that way. And so this is what we're attempting to recreate here with Darker Than Blue. And so, like we say, we will be here every Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, bringing you that same analysis, the same politics, the same energy that you know from us, and just, you know, doing it as we always have. Jackie, a couple minutes left. Yeah. Oh, we're down to our button.
Yep.
We're gonna have to get used to. So again, this has been Darker Than Blue at WPFW. Next up, News and Views with Garland Nixon, and we will see you next time. Peace.
Peace.
Thank you for listening to the Just Completed program. If you'd like to offer feedback,